Hello, my name is Marvin, and this is a cautionary tale about how a trusted friendship turned into the biggest betrayal of my life. I always assumed I'd figured out people I was older and had spent half my life dealing with corporate fakeness and seeing all kinds of individuals. So naturally, I thought I could predict the type of people they were. But meeting Gary threw everything I knew straight out the window. I still believe in kindness and friendship, but my encounter with Gary changed my life forever. I never looked at people the same way again. I first met Gary while working at a major software development company. I was part of a very senior team, and I'd spent 2 decades working my way up the corporate ladder. I'd always been fascinated with technology since I was young. Being from a small town with modest means never stopped me from pursuing my passion. Fancy gadgets weren't the cheapest toys for a kid, but my parents ensured that I had whatever latest tech existed at the time. Years of hard work and a scholarship later, I landed a junior position in a big league software company. It was difficult at first, and the corporate ladder is a tedious one to climb. The heavy workload is inevitable, but no one warned me about office politics. In the beginning, I was assigned to a small team, and we were involved in cutting-edge projects, the kind of stuff I'd always dreamt of, and yet, office life wasn't quite ideal. Despite the exciting work that came my way, the gloom and doom of corporate life were inescapable. Even though the job was incredible, I spent the better part of a decade struggling with corporate culture, and another decade adapting to it. You see, people in corporate had this fakeness to them. I came from an ordinary background with simple folks, and all my life I'd known people who were straight shooters. But here, while the company did have some incredibly intelligent people, almost all of them were pretenders in some form. I'd happily confide my truest thoughts to some people, only to learn that they thought of me as a small-town idiot behind my back. It worsened as the years passed, and I eventually began keeping to myself. I was fortunate to find a select few friends within the company, but none of them were very close either. In moments like these, I felt quite alone despite finding immense joy in my work. With few friends and no partner to keep me company, my greatest companions remained my books and my work. I remained this way for several years, but it all changed after Gary's arrival. Little did I know that both my personal and professional worlds would be shaken forever by this man. I distinctly remember the first day I saw him. I was early for work to oversee the completion of a large project. Everyone in the office had gathered in a small crowd around our boss, Stephen, as he introduced Gary. Everyone kindly joined me in welcoming our newest employee, Gary. He's a bright young mind with lots of potential, and I can't wait to see how he performs in our company. Following his brief introduction, Gary went around all the rows of desks, enthusiastically greeting everyone. He finally arrived at me. "Hello, Call me Marvin. It's a pleasure to have you here." "The pleasure's all mine. I can't wait to work with all of you genius folks and mainly learn from you." "Well, buckle up. You're in for a great ride. Welcome to the family." From the get-go, Gary seemed like quite the decent fellow. He was polite, handsome, friendly, and most importantly, he seemed sincere. Seemed is the key word here, as looks were often deceptive. He was nice, almost too nice, and I was afraid the office people would begin their usual ritual of gossip and politics, leaving him confused and alone. Oddly enough, this never happened. Gary just seemed to charm the socks off anyone he became close to, which was eventually everyone in the office. Suddenly, within only months, everyone seemed to adore this man. I won't deny that I felt just a tad bit jealous. After all, it was strange being treated with only hostility after 20 years in the company, and suddenly even the most unfriendly coworkers seemed to warm up to this young new employee. He was like a rock star in the office. During lunch, he'd gather all the employees and regale them with tales of his past company projects, some of which seemed too good to be true. I was initially a bit bitter and wouldn't speak to him as often as the other coworkers did. But this complicated matters several months later, when Stephen summoned me to his office. I was nervous and feared that I may have reacted too coldly to Gary, and that's what Stephen wanted to talk about. But the actual news caught me completely off guard. "Marvin, you've been a loyal employee of this company for the last 2 decades. My father admired you as well." "Thank you, sir. We all flourished under his mentorship." "Exactly. As a matter of fact, that's what I wanted to talk to you about." "What about, sir?" "I've noticed Gary is an exceptional employee, but he's still inexperienced to join some of our biggest projects." "Well, he'll learn on the job, sir. Just give it some time." No, I've already decided I want you to mentor him." I was shocked and felt conflicted by Stephen's instructions. On the one hand, I'd become slightly bitter toward Gary, but on the other hand, I was honored that Marvin chose me, of all employees, to mentor him. Later that day, I had a conversation with Gary as he was leaving the office cafeteria. "Hey Gary, could I speak to you for a moment?" "Sure thing." "Actually, I'm surprised you remember me. Why's that?" "You're the only one who seems to ignore me here. Have I done something to you?" I was immediately embarrassed. "No, not at all, dumb, I had a word with Stephen. He told me that I have to take you under my wing." "How come?" "He wants you to start working on the larger projects." "Oh my God, that's..." Gary shook my hand excitedly and leaned in for a hug. I was taken aback by his eagerness. He seemed delighted at the idea of my mentorship, and I started feeling as though I'd misjudged the man, but I should have relied on my instincts as always. I began mentoring Gary from the very next day itself. He worked closely with our senior team, and I guided him on the technicalities of the project. Perhaps bitterness had clouded my judgment, but Stephen was right. Gary was a quick learner and picked up on everything I taught him. He was under my wing for the next couple of weeks, and I was honestly impressed with his abilities. One evening, I was working overtime at the office when Gary appeared out of nowhere. "What are you doing here?" "Everyone's left for the day?" "I know. But I figured the two of us hadn't really had a chat." "A chat about what?" "Anything. See, I don't just like to work with people but befriend them too." "Okay, so tell me about yourself." I was genuinely surprised by Gary's initiative to become closer friends, but I welcomed it nonetheless. He got us both dinner that night, and we remained in the office for an hour, sharing stories of our pasts and how we ended up in the company. All my petty jealousy and bitterness faded away, and for the first time, I began to see Gary in a positive light. I learned about his heartbreaking past as an orphan and how he struggled against all odds to pursue his passion, something that deeply resonated with me. Hailing from a small town myself, his words struck a chord with me. The two of us began spending more time together, both personally and professionally, and over time I viewed him not just as a colleague but as the son and companion I never really had. I even shared things about others with him, about Stephen's temper for instance, and how I wasn't the fondest of him. However, all of this was told to him in confidence. Things went swimmingly for the longest time, until one weekday a few months later. Stephen's daughter, Rita, worked in another department, but she was visiting our floor that day. Stephen excitedly introduced her to Gary, and in his typical fashion, he completely charmed and won her over too. It felt slightly weird that he was trying to woo the boss daughter, but I guess if he was enjoying his life and balancing work so well, I couldn't really complain. After having mentored him for a few months, I certainly believed I was wrong about ever having doubted him. That is until a close friend of mine, Margaret, approached me the same day. She worked in the company's HR department and personally came over to my desk. "I need to talk to you about something, Marvin. Could we do it during lunch? I'm kind of in the middle of. It's about Gary." "Well, what about him? You're going to want to see this." We went over to Margaret's private cabin, where she double-checked that nobody was following us and then locked the door. I was confused by all the secrecy but curious to hear what she'd found. I was rearranging all employee forms when I found this. She laid out Gary's form in front of me. I examined it closely. "What's wrong with this? Seems pretty standard." His schooling was right here, in the city. I suddenly felt strange. I recalled Gary telling me about being an orphan and how his foster parents homeschooled him in a small town, but the form revealed that Gary went to school in the city. I don't understand. Why would he lie? I don't know. But there's more. My son used to go to this school, and I remember that he told me about an incident years ago. There'd been a cheating scam in the school, and it was run by this kid named Gary. I felt sudden knots in my stomach. It couldn't be. Is it? Yes. I called and double-checked with the school. It's the same Gary who works here. What does this prove, though? I mean, if he's lied about his past, who knows what else he's lying about? What else he's hiding? So what do you plan to do? I'm thinking of sharing this with Stephen, to see what he thinks. I was alarmed at the suddenness of it all. For the first time, I'd finally found a reliable companion in life, only to learn that he'd lied to me. I wasn't quite sure what to make of the situation. I returned to my desk, still wondering about what I'd just heard. The very same day, Margaret visited Stephen's office to share her findings with him. But what happened next was absolutely shocking. I decided not to confront Gary about everything and returned home normally that day. The next morning I arrived at work, only to find Margaret's desk vacant. There was some commotion as Stephen rounded up all the employees and addressed us. In view of certain events and for reasons I cannot fully disclose, this company has decided to let go of our beloved HR employee, Margaret. She left this morning and didn't want to be here, but we wish her the best of luck in the future. All employees seemed shocked, but I was even more so. I couldn't understand what was going on. Margaret was simply supposed to share her findings with Stephen, but how did it result in her getting fired? There was only one way to find out. I approached Gary during lunch, who remained his cheery and optimistic self, unbothered by everything that had happened. I took him aside and had a conversation. "Gary, were you close to Margaret?" "Well, not much. But she was clearly a bit crazy, don't you think?" "Crazy? How so?" "I mean, she went to Stephen yesterday with the most insane accusations. She said I was part of some cheating scam and she tracked down my school. Can you believe it? She told me some things, yes." "What? You didn't share it with me?" "I didn't think it was true either, so." Gary's face turned to one of suspicion, but then he seemed to relax. "You should have told me earlier. Anyway, it's all water under the bridge now." "Was it true, though? I mean, Margaret seemed pretty confident, and I don't think she'd dig up something like that randomly." Stephen called me to his office and I explained to him that Margaret always had a vendetta against me. It was all baseless. She was a bit paranoid, don't you think? "I don't know. But what about your schooling? Did you go here, in the city?" "My aunt was here, so yes, I spent one semester here, but I had to financially support my aunt and I dropped out of that school to help her make ends meet. I worked as a mopper and whatnot." "Oh, I'm really sorry, I had no idea." "You trust me, right? You're like a father to me." "Of course I do. Don't worry." I empathized with Gary's revelation about his aunt, but I was still conflicted about Margaret's dismissal. I wasn't especially close to her, but she was never one to make false accusations. However, there was nothing I could do about the situation. Perhaps the worst thing I did was trust Gary and let it go, unaware that this would be the first domino of many to come. There was a massive project our company had to present to a major client. Stephen told us that it was a two-person project and he wanted me, given my seniority, and another accomplished colleague of mine. I initially thought of selecting one of my senior colleagues with whom I'd collaborated dozens of times. However, given that this was such a large-scale project and could be a massive learning curve for a newbie, I decided to work on the project with Gary. It was an unusual decision on my part and it sparked debates around the office. But Stephen was very pleased with my decision and was glad that I was still mentoring Gary. Despite the rough patch involving Margaret, I still believed in Gary, and over time, as the two of us worked on this project, my doubts began to fade away. It was initially difficult for him and I had to guide him a lot through the technicalities of the project. We worked day and night for about a month until the day of the presentation finally arrived. I was both nervous and excited. I knew that if things went well and we managed to acquire the client, it would mean wonders for Gary, me, and mainly for the company. However, little did I know that the most anticipated day of my life would become the most controversial day ever. Gary and I promptly arrived for the meeting with the client. Stephen, Rita, and a host of other senior employees were present at the meeting. I'd laid the groundwork for the project and I'd trusted Gary to complete the presentation part of it. There was even an aspect about a marketing campaign, including a new logo, all of which I'd left to Gary's creative abilities. As everyone sat down, I began with the presentation and covered the fundamentals of the project. I then asked Gary to continue with the rest. I couldn't tell what the clients were thinking, but Gary was doing pretty well till he reached his part about the marketing. And so, this is the strategy we believe for marketing. Excuse me, I believe this is incorrect. Everyone in the room froze. Stephen and Rita's faces went cold, as did mine. This marketing model's copied from somewhere, I'm sure of it. Hell, so is this logo. I saw this exact model and logo at a net company's presentation a few years ago. The room burst into whispers and gasps. Stephen went pale. He stared at both Gary and me with evident disappointment. Rita seemed devastated. Wanting to protect Gary, I decided to intervene. "Sir, I apologize for this oversight, but we do believe the marketing isn't exactly similar, and it still has some elements which I used to work in marketing for 15 years before I landed this position. I know a hurried and copied campaign when I see one." This right here is a prime example of a shameless copy. Everyone in the room was suddenly anxious. Panic filled the air. I saw Stephen getting up, preparing to apologize to the client until Gary suddenly spoke up. I apologize for all the confusion. I'm really sorry, everyone, and I want to admit the truth. For a moment, I was taken aback by Gary's words. I expected a brave display of honesty, but nothing prepared me for the sheer betrayal that would follow. I've worked on the project tirelessly, but it was Marvin's decision to go ahead with this marketing campaign. I'd told him repeatedly to avoid this, but he told me, and I quote, "Nobody will find out." I was just following orders, and I'm sorry to embarrass the company. All eyes in the room turned towards me. Stephen seemed crushed and disappointed by me. Before I could argue my side, the client spoke first. "Stephen, I came here with a lot of hope, but it's clear there are a lot of internal issues you need to sort out. I'll see you later." With that, the client took off, leaving behind the most awkward tension in the room. I didn't waste a second. "He's lying. Stephen, he's a liar. Enough. I'll see you both in my office. Gary, come with me." I felt shocked, barely processing the events. Stephen, Gary, and Rita stormed out of the office along with the other employees. I was stunned. How could this have happened? I waited patiently outside Stephen's office, just waiting to confront Gary and watch him admit the truth. Everyone in the office pretended to work, but they were interested in the drama that was brewing. A short while later, Gary walked out of Stephen's office, not meeting my eye. Before I could run after him, Stephen called me inside. I walked in and saw Rita as well. I was determined to clear my side of the story. "Sir, you've known me for such a long time. You, of all people, know that I haven't made any presentation errors in 20 years. How could I ever resort to copying a campaign? I assigned marketing to Gary. It was solely his job, and I don't know why he lied." Stephen seemed to be battling conflicting feelings as well. "Well, be that as it may, Marvin, but Gary has made some very serious accusations about you. Beyond this presentation." I felt uncomfortable in my seat. It was like a two-person ambush. I was afraid of what other false accusations had been made about me. "I admire you, Marvin. I always have. But Gary has raised some serious concerns. He says that you took control of the entire project and forced him to present the whole thing. He also said that you commented bitter things about my father to him and that Margaret and you fabricated a story because the two of you were jealous of him." I couldn't believe my ears. Gary's lies knew no bounds. He told us that once Margaret was out of the company, you decided to take revenge via the project, and there were moments where he felt terrified of you. Firstly, sir, I would never say ill things about you. Is that right? Well, Gary left us a very interesting recording. I suddenly felt knots in my stomach again. Stephen revealed Gary's phone and laid it on the desk. He played a recording from it, which shook me to my core. It was a conversation I'd had ages ago with Gary. Marvin in the recording. Stephen's honestly annoying most times. Sometimes I can't believe his father left the whole company to his idiot son, but I guess it's fine. He's nowhere as experienced as the others, and frankly his business decisions can be stupid sometimes. At that moment I knew everything was going to change. I couldn't believe Gary had recorded our conversations secretly, things I'd trusted him with. Now confronted with this head-on, there really wasn't a way out of the situation. "I don't know what to say, Marvin. You just lied to my face, plain as day, and I don't know what else you've lied about. And after the client disaster, I'm afraid we're finished. Please clear your desk within the hour." It all fell apart just like that. I argued back and forth with Stephen and Rita for a while, but their decision was final. With no other choice, I walked out of Stephen's cabin, broken and betrayed. All the other employees watched me clear my desk, unable to digest what had just happened. I couldn't believe 20 years of my career had culminated in such a shocking betrayal. I was leaving the floor when I saw him. Gary was resting by a corner, whispering to some other employees. He saw me and began walking away, but I stopped him. "Stop right there, Gary. Just face me one last time." To my surprise, Gary waited as the other employees left. We were finally alone together after the events of that morning, and I was ready to confront him. "Why? Why would you do that? After everything? After I mentored you? After you were my only friend here? You were like a son to me." However, Gary didn't flinch. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I trusted you. You better watch out now. I'm going to meet with Margaret and we're going to expose you, Gary. Just watch out." "You headed home then?" "Since I'm unemployed now, yes. I'm going home, Gary." "Okay, I wish you the best of luck then." Gary began walking away with his phone in hand, calling someone. I never gave it much attention and walked away. I should have known that phone call was probably the root of all that was to come. I headed out of the building and took a taxi on my way back home. Heartbroken by everything that had occurred, I wanted to reach home and contact Margaret as soon as I could to see how we could plan something against Gary. I couldn't fathom that 20 years of my service were destroyed by a lying young man. I was seething with rage. There was an isolated stretch of road that led to my house, but that day I encountered something unusual. There was a stationary car on the side of the road and a woman leaning against it. She began waving at the taxi. Concerned, I immediately asked the driver to pull over. On a closer look, the woman was pregnant. "Hello, do you need any help?" "Hi, I was just headed home, but my car broke down." "That's terrible. I could give you a lift home." "That's kind, but really don't want to leave my car. Could you help me fix it instead?" I was slightly confused by her reluctance to leave the car. Nevertheless, I decided to help her out. My father owned a garage back in the day and I'd spend whole summers fixing up cars. I paid the taxi driver and decided to help the woman. It took me a while, but I was able to fix up the car. The woman was delighted. "Thank you so much." "It's my pleasure. You can be on your way then. I'll catch another taxi." "As a matter of fact, could you drive my car instead?" "I don't feel so well. You can take a cab from my neighborhood." I wasn't entirely in the mood to drive, but the woman was pregnant and requesting, so I couldn't really refuse. The two of us sat in the car and I drove to the address she gave me. "My name's Tori." "I'm Martin. Nice to meet you. My husband usually drives me everywhere, but he was busy at work today." "That's okay. This is really no trouble at all." The two of us spoke for a bit while I drove. I was so focused on her words that I never noticed a taxi tailing us, a detail I wouldn't realize until much later. As we were nearing her house, Tori suddenly changed her mind. Actually, if you don't mind, could we grab a cup of coffee? I'm craving one and there's a cafe round the corner." "Sure." I was hesitant to join Tori, given everything that had happened throughout the day, but I figured I could use a cup of coffee too. We sat in the cafe and ordered 2 coffees. Tori began telling me about her life and her husband. I listened intently and enjoyed her company, but something very strange occurred just then. Tori leaned in closer. "Could I sit next to you, please?" I felt uncomfortable at her request, but still obliged. Tori came closer and began ranting about her husband, talking about how he mistreated her. She began crying and buried her face in my arms. Helpless and confused, I wasn't sure how to react. I hugged her gently and comforted her. It felt incredibly strange doing so, but I guess she needed the support at that moment. Once she was done crying, she returned to her seat across the table. "I appreciated that, thank you so much." Just a few moments later, I heard footsteps approaching our table. I figured it was just another waiter passing by until I heard a chillingly familiar voice. It couldn't be. "Did you follow me here?" I was speechless. Gary was the last person I expected to see here. "Gary? What on earth are you doing here? What are you doing here?" "This is my wife." Tori immediately stood up to embrace Gary. I was still bewildered by what was going on. "What? Tori is your wife? We've been married for 3 years, but you told me you're unmarried." "Oh, not this again." To Gary, "Honey, is this the liar guy you told me about at work?" "Yes, it is. Look at him. He won't even stop lying in front of you. Let's go, honey." "Wah. What's going on?" The two of them walked out of the cafe in a hurry while I sat there, trying to catch my breath and struggling to make sense of the situation. I'd barely come to terms with Gary's deception at the presentation, but him having a pregnant wife and lying in front of her? I couldn't understand who the real Gary was anymore. I walked out of the cafe and took a taxi straight home. My mind was jumbled and my thoughts were all over the place. Getting fired and being betrayed by Gary twice, none of it made sense any longer. I spent the entire evening wondering what my next move should be. I was supposed to call Margaret, but I was frankly still reeling from the cafe incident. But Gary's trump card arrived later that night. I was sitting alone in my living room, mindlessly scrolling through cable. That's when someone knocked at my door. My mind raced with all the possibilities. I was afraid it might be Gary. I cautiously answered the door, but it was no one I recognized, just a young boy holding a thick envelope. "Can I help you?" "Yes, someone asked me to give it to you." "Who asked you to?" "What is this?" It's just some photos, that's all." The boy sprinted away before I could ask any further questions. The day felt so surreal, given everything that had occurred, and now this strange encounter with a random boy. Curious, I opened the envelope on my dining table. However, its contents horrified me. How was it possible? The envelope contained photographs of Tori and me at the cafe from earlier that day. The photos were taken at the exact moment Tori sat beside me while she cried. But the photos were framed scandalously, almost as though we were intimately hugging each other. I was scratching my head, desperately trying to figure out who might have done this. Suddenly, my telephone began ringing. I answered it, eager to know what was going on. And of course, it was him all along. "Good evening, Marvin. I hope you received my envelope." "Gary, what on earth is this? Who clicked these?" "Isn't it obvious? Now, you threatened me this morning, saying that you would coordinate with Margaret to take me down. You shan't be doing anything of the sort, or else these photos will be circulated to every single person you know. But, your wife. She'll explain everything. That's not my wife, you idiot. Tori's my sister, and she isn't pregnant. If these photos come out, she'll do exactly what I tell her to, the same way she waited for you on your route home today and distracted you." My whole world seemed to crumble. It felt as though I had to reevaluate every single thing I'd ever known about Gary and the events of that day. "Don't you go scheming with Margaret or anyone. Remember these photos and mark my words." Gary ended the call, while I still grappled with everything I'd just heard. How would I even navigate this situation? I'd just been fired and betrayed by Gary, and now he was holding me hostage, preventing me from ever conspiring against him. I couldn't figure out how to get back at him. He had the strange boy deliver the envelope right to my doorstep, so he already knew my address. Was he following me? Would he continue to keep watch on me throughout? Was my phone tapped so that Gary could track it? A million questions flooded my mind. I could hardly sleep that night, given all the events of the day. But despite insurmountable odds, I knew I had to fight back against Gary. I couldn't let him win. There had to be a way to expose him. I'd been outmaneuvered by him at every single turn, and I would have to figure out ways to outsmart him. And even though this went against my nature, I would have to play it as twisted as Gary did. I first checked my phone to ensure that it wasn't tapped, after which I contacted Margaret. I explained the entire situation to her, and she told me about her side as well. Gary got me fired too. He told Steven a whole bunch of lies. We have to figure out a way to deal with him. But how? He has the upper hand with everything. He threatened to expose that I took $5,000 from the company accounts to pay off my son's medical bills. It was 6 years ago, but he somehow found the records to threaten me. I was unaware of this information and was shocked to learn this. While I didn't necessarily agree with Margaret's actions, I had no idea Gary would sink this low and exploit what she did for her son's condition. Whatever the case was, and no matter how bleak it seemed, I was determined to put an end to Gary's exploitation and expose him for the fraud that he was. It took Margaret and me a day to figure out potential plans, and we finally put one into motion immediately. We decided to delve deep into Gary's background. We figured that if he managed to betray 2 senior people within the same company in a matter of months, this probably wasn't new for him, and we soon realized there were other people in Gary's past that he must have betrayed as well. I'd been an ethical hacker back in my college days, and I decided it was time to put those skills to use. I relentlessly researched for a couple of days and finally discovered what I was looking for: a list of people who'd tried reaching out to Gary via email but had been ignored. They accused Gary of betraying them. I reached out to those people, explaining my situation and the assistance that I was looking for. I wasn't sure whether I would receive replies, but I was shocked to see 6 emails from different people, all confessing how they'd been wronged by Gary. I was appalled to learn about all the horrible things Gary had pulled off with these people, from selling someone a fictional property to absconding with another's retirement money. There was no end to his selfishness. As Margaret and I got on a call to discuss the next moves, we landed on a golden solution. "Marvin, you realize we have 6 people Gary has betrayed, 8 including the 2 of us, but these 6 victims are spread across states, so every crime he commits, he believes he'll never be caught because none of these people know each other." Exactly. This is our chance. Without wasting time, we sprung to action. I began gathering information from those 6 individuals, while Margaret kept a close watch over Gary and Tori to uncover additional information about them. Those individuals emailed me dozens of false documents Gary had fabricated, including false passports, bank letters, IDs, and even false marriage certificates with Tori. The best part was that most documents had Gary's photograph or his actual signature attached to them. But the most golden piece of evidence would arrive through Margaret. As I shared my findings eagerly with her, she shared her bombshell of a revelation. Margaret told me that she'd been following Gary each day after his work, noting his movements between the office and his home. I asked Margaret to email me the evidence, and what she sent was just incredibly ironic. She'd captured photographs of Gary becoming intimate with another woman. While this wasn't significant on its own, Margaret had found out through her office connections that Gary was now dating Rita. We now had the perfect opportunity to surprise him. Margaret was eager to send the photos to Gary right then and surprise him with the allegation from the other 6 individuals, but I had a more elaborate plan in mind. It took me a week to orchestrate it, but I was able to pull it off. I had no car of my own, so I asked Margaret one evening to drive us to Gary's neighborhood, and we parked her car a little away from his house. I'm confused. What are we doing here? Just wait for it. At the stroke of 6, a few cars began pulling up outside Gary and Tori's house. Margaret was stunned. There's no way. Are they? Yes. Let the fireworks begin. All 6 individuals from the emails were now present here finally. All of them were armed with the documents they'd shared with me. I'd asked everyone to come sharp at 6 so they could collectively reach his house. A fancy car arrived 2 minutes later, and a crying Rita stepped out of it. She marched to Gary's house along with the 6 other individuals. She was holding photographs. How did you pull that off? Just enjoy it. All of them rang Gary's doorbell, and he cheerfully answered the door. However, all the blood drained away from his face upon seeing everyone together. It was the most helpless, shattered, and lost I'd ever seen the man. Tori rushed out as well, but was equally speechless. All 7 individuals burst into a screaming match, holding up documents and hurling accusations. It was overwhelming for Gary. All his web of lies had finally caught up to him. Right at his doorstep, there was nowhere to run. How could you? You better lawyer up. The cops are on their way. Margaret couldn't stop smiling. Okay, let's leave. We've enjoyed the show. I've got some work to do. What work? I've got to mail $5,000 back to the company, so let's head out. I was overwhelmed. Not only had Margaret and I managed to take our revenge, but she'd also saved up enough money to repay the amount she stole. I honestly couldn't have asked for a more fitting ode to justice, not just for us, but for all those who'd been wronged by Gary.